Alright, before we get into the video, say hello to my new favorite shirt. Probably my favorite band of all time, in the top 2. It's In This Moment and As Tall as Lions. And last night I saw In This Moment live, and it was sick. And I got this shirt, and you're gonna be seeing a lot of it. So, get used to it. I had to make sure I didn't scream too loud last night, because I knew I was filming this video today. And it's gonna be a long one. So, buckle up. About 300 million years ago, the world was ramping up for its final bow to the Paleozoic era. It was the start of the Permian period, which lasted from 299 to 252 million years ago. Sharks and their relatives were equipped with some insane weaponry. The Synapsids, i.e. our ancestors, and Sauropsids, the ancestors to birds and reptiles, were starting a tug of war that has gone on to this day. But all of this would end in a devastation that would take the world into the age of the dinosaurs. Today, I'll be giving you the rundown and introduce you to some strange creatures you might have never heard of. My name is Lindsay Nikole, and this is the history of life on Earth that we know of. Let's get the global conditions out of the way. First off, we are finally, fully, at the full time of supercontinent Pangea. Remember, throughout the Carboniferous, the global climate was going from warm and humid to cool and dry. So the Permian was just, boom, dry to an approximation. Because of Pangea, we had one massive ocean and one massive slab of land that stretched all the way from the north to the south pole. So everything in the middle of that slab of land was dry as fuck. I can't even imagine what the equator was like. One of the great things about water is that it tends to have a moderating effect on nearby land. And the interior of Pangea didn't have that, so shit was fluctuating like nobody's business in the seasonal sense. But luckily, plants were still doing their thing. As far as we know, land plants throughout the Permian were just starting to look more and more like plants today. Lepidodendron and Sigillaria were still around from the Carboniferous, but their 15 minutes of fame was over. The gymnosperms, i.e. the seed plants, were really cooking, and for good reason. Seeds are really resistant to environmental stressors and have nutrients for the plant embryo. So you can kind of think of them as the plant version of the amniotic egg that some vertebrates became equipped with last time. But seeds came first, probably sometime in the Devonian like I mentioned, and I would argue are even better than amniotic eggs, clearly more durable. I tried to quickly take an egg out of the refrigerator the other day for one of my recipes, and squeezed it a little bit too hard and it cracked in the egg carton. So 1 point for seeds. So anyway, by the Permian, gymnosperms were the dominant land plants that we know of. Some notable species from the time were Glossopteris, arguably the most famous plant of the Permian, Walchia, Peltospermoles, just some classic mega ancient plant material. I know this next section usually comes later in the videos, but I just want to get it out of the way now. The trilobites. They're still around.
Why are we still here?
Looking pretty much identical to what they looked like in the Permian. Over 200 million years of this, the queens of consistency. Like I had mentioned last time, they were slowly becoming less and less relevant. The couple of mass extinctions they had survived had taken a toll on them, and they weren't what they used to be, but they were still here. I'm not saying something considering all the shit they went through. Now that we've reached the end of the Paleozoic era, there's a big shift in what the fossil record deems the icons of this period. In the Cambrian, we had a shit ton of invertebrates. Weird ones. Same with the Ordovician and the Silurian, sea scorpions, etc. The Devonian did have that big vertebrate transition to land, but there was also still shit like Mimetaster, or as many of you called it, Mind Taster. Which one is correct? I don't know. Doesn't really matter. And also shit like Gigolopterus. And then obviously the Carboniferous speaks for itself. But from now on, the vertebrates are the stars of the show. It is now the mega bone zone. Read my lips! It's a bone zone! That's not to say that invertebrates are suddenly not interesting. The fossil record just doesn't like them. Fossil record likes bones. Big, thick bones. Who knows how many insane invertebrate species we've just lost to the rocks. I mean, think of Deep Staria, dude. That jellyfish alive today. There's no way there's gonna be fossils of them 100 million years from now. Maybe of their resident isopod, but I digress. That's all to say that this video and the rest of the videos in the series are about to get heavily tetrapod. So, let's start off with the ones that are still attached to the water.
Ironic.
Allow me to introduce you to Eriops, a big-headed amphibian that lived in lowland pond, stream, and floodland habitats. They got to about 6 to 10 feet long and weighed up to 450 pounds, and had a pretty ossified, i.e. rigid, skeleton to support their massive body while they moved around on land. Fossil evidence suggests they still had their lateral line, that fish thing for movement in the water. So they probably hung out on land and then went dining in the rivers and swamps for delicious fish and other amphibians. They also had a mouth that was seemingly very suited for crushing, so their diet might have had some shelled creatures in the mix as well. Another amphibious icon of the Permian is Prionosuchus, which is quite gharial crocodile-like in form. Most specimens found have been 6 to 8 feet long, which is pretty intense, but the largest fragmented specimen ever found suggests a max length of 18 feet long, which is just horrific. Well, actually, some of the largest crocodiles alive today are about that length, so I guess it's just neutral by today's standards. Or, I guess if you didn't know crocodiles could get that big, then you got 2 horrific things for the price of 1. I don't know. Let me know. Unlike Eriops, who seem to have spent their time kind of 50-50 between land and water, Prionosuchus was definitely in water. Hydrophilic, if you will. Based on the lack of powerful limbs, they likely swam like crocodiles today, using their long, powerful tails to propel them through the water, while the limbs were more for steering and stability. Given their max size, they were potentially apex predators of the waterways, snatching up fish and other amphibians like nobody's business, which would have sucked for fish and other amphibians. The last amphibian in the Permian lineup was actually discovered just in time for this video. Kermitops, named after Kermit the Frog. Great timing if you ask me. Despite being named after the beloved frog, Kermitops was not a frog. Frogs did not exist yet, that we know of. Not until the next period. They were more of a salamander, but we don't really have any famous salamanders they could have named it after, so boom. Kermit the Frog. They were very small. Their skull is 3 centimeters long by 2 centimeters wide. And that's really all the information I have for you because they were literally described like yesterday, so that's all for now. All right, moving on to the amniotes, specifically the synapsids and the sauropsids. Remember last time I mentioned sauropsid lineage gave rise to birds and reptiles, and the synapsid lineage eventually gave rise to mammals. They were each getting their footing in the Carboniferous, kind of looked the same physically. You can kind of think of it as they were figuring their shit out together. Couldn't really tell them apart from each other, aside from the temporal fenestra. By the time the Permian came around, they were ready to brawl. They figured out how to establish themselves, and were becoming more and more different, diverging further and further away from their humble beginnings. This was the start to a kind of tug of war between the synapsids and sauropsids that continues to this day. Who's the top dog? Who's the underdog? Let's start with the sauropsids. I'm not going to tell you which is which yet. I'm going to introduce you to some of the key players of each so you can guess, and then I'll tell you. Ancestors to dinosaurs, birds, and other reptiles. Looked like lizards in their humble beginnings. So, let's see what they're up to now. One of the larger groups in the Permian were the Pariasaurs, who, despite their name, were actually more of the jocks of this period. Massive, plant-eating creatures that had these huge bony knobs and spikes all over their body. Had their own built-in armor. They were just absolute tanks. Unlike most other reptiles of the time, they actually held their legs underneath their bodies rather than sprawled out. The classic reptilian stance is definitely sprawled out, like they just got caught being up to no good. Pariasaurs were not into this. Too heavy. Needed more support. Arguably the most well-known pariasaur is Scutosaurus, named after, you guessed it, the scutes all over their heads. Remember scutes from, was that the Cool Fossils video? I think it was the Cool Fossils video. Scutes, a heavily built animal indeed, with some individuals estimated to have gotten over 2,200 pounds, which is about the weight of a Ford Fiesta. The Permian also saw the first aquatic reptiles that we know of, that weren't actually true sauropsids, but were on the sauropsid side of the split, if that makes sense. The mesosaurs, not to be confused with mosasaurs who came later.
I hope that doesn't come back and bite me in the ash.
The mesosaurs were much more chill, and their proportions just didn't really make sense. They had long, thin skulls, long necks, huge, webbed hind legs, banana-shaped ribs, and a massive, laterally flat tail to swim around. They also had these pretty gnarly needle-like teeth that scientists can't really compare to any animals alive today. Kind of like a dolphin, kind of like a gharial crocodile again, but not really. So what exactly their diet might have been is not immediately clear. But researchers in Germany decided to get to the bottom of this in 2022. They examined 270 mosasaur specimens. Not to be confused with mosasaurs who came later. All of different sizes and slightly different morphologies, and found in different areas that indicate different types of prehistoric habitats. The different habitats could have suggested different species, which previous studies suggested. But the results of this 2022 paper suggest the different size and habitats suggest different ages, different stages of life. That juvenile mosasaurs, mesosaurs. I hope I didn't say that at any other point. I did! Whoops.
Oh no! Anyway.
The juvenile mesosaurs spent their time near the coast as active predators, and then adults went further out into the open ocean with a more filter-feeding lifestyle. Whatever the case, that didn't last very long that we know of. Fossil evidence suggests they were only around during the early Permian, so an unfortunate evolutionary dead end. Alright, so the sauropsid team had big guys, aquatic guys, and also flying guys. Well, gliding, but in the air nonetheless.
This isn't flying, this is falling with style.
Coelurosaurus, absolutely darling. They had these elongated rod-like bones along the sides of their body that supported a wing-like membrane, allowing them to glide from tree to tree, kind of like a flying squirrel, or a sugar glider, whichever you prefer. They also had sharp, curved claws for gripping bark, so they could climb up trees, like coconut crabs today. Gliding as an adaptation just makes sense. Forests were getting more and more dense, and the trees were getting a bit crowded, not necessarily the place you would go to avoid becoming a snack. If the predator can climb too, you're screwed, so boom, glide away. Easy peasy. Before we move on to the next group, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Delete Me. Raise your hand if you like when your personal information is protected. Now raise your hand if you don't like when your personal information is sold online by data brokers. Me too. I hate when that happens. It exposes you to identity theft, potential phishing, financial risk, and just general harm, as if you are a fish in Prionosuchus-infested waters. That's why I personally recommend Delete Me, the hands-free subscription service that will remove your personal information that's being sold online. By removing your data from hundreds of websites, they help reclaim your privacy and keep you safe. Using Delete Me, I've seen my data vanish from tons of sites, reducing my exposure to identity theft and phishing attempts. Delete Me's dashboard gives you a clear view of the sites your data has been removed from and all the pieces of information they've deleted for you. But wait! It gets better. Delete Me has a special coupon for you, i.e. a viewer of this channel, for 20% off all US consumer plans. Type in coupon code Lindsay at checkout or go to joindeleteme.com/Lindsay, whatever's easier, and get started protecting your privacy. Thank you, Delete Me, for sponsoring this video. Now, on to the Synapsids, whose diversity was absolutely nuts during this time. Some were small, insectivorous species, while others were large, apex predators, and some of the largest terrestrial vertebrates of the period that we know of. Let's start off with the most well-known synapsid of the time, Dimetrodon. You've probably heard of them before. They get grouped in with dinosaurs pretty frequently because of their appearance. I'm gonna guess it's a mix-up with Stegosaurus, but they were not the same as Stegosaurus. Not even close. Dimetrodon is iconic on its own. They've been featured in the Jurassic World TV show, probably Land Before Time, best show ever. They were also in those little toy sets they used to sell at Michael's. I specifically remember that. Any dinosaur franchise shit, I'm willing to bet Dimetrodon is in it at some point in time. But again, they don't belong there because they were Permian synapsids. They were like your great 3 weeks later great-grandfather's cousin, and they were totally and completely badass. They could get to over 12 feet long and had this massive sail on their back that seems to have been used for thermoregulation, i.e. maintaining a certain internal body temperature. Blood pumped into the sail could have been warmed up in the sun or cooled down in a nice breeze. And that sail makes for some of the sickest fossils I've ever seen in my entire life. Mark my words, I will be getting that skeleton tattooed on me. Get me that skeleton. Sorry, Mom. I'm not done. Before we get to the next synapsids, I have to address, you might be thinking, wait, what the fuck? When did thermoregulation become a thing? Or you might be like, what the fuck is thermoregulation? So you know, some people refer to animals as warm-blooded and cold-blooded, like cats are warm-blooded and snakes are cold-blooded. Hold on. Odie! Alright, never mind. I was gonna grab the cat. Whatever. So cats are called warm-blooded because they produce and maintain their own internal body temperature. They are endotherms. Heat inside. Snakes are called cold-blooded because their body temperature depends on the environment. When it's colder, they are colder. When it's hotter, they are hotter. They are ectotherms. Heat outside. That's why Tino needs a heating pad. Ectotherms are the default, as you would probably guess. Invertebrates, fishes, amphibians, and reptiles are all ectotherms. Almost said endotherms. Ectotherms. Endothermic groups only evolved twice that we know of. Birds and mammals. With a few random exceptions, of course, because nature never gives shit to you straight. When exactly endothermy evolved in the ancestors to mammals and birds, i.e. synapsids and sauropsids, is still a bit of a mystery. For the synapsids specifically, it's thought the roots are somewhere in the Permian. So the ideas of the function of Dimetrodon's sail have that in mind. But obviously, warm-bloodedness does not really fossilize. It's honestly a fucking mess. There's like different estimates using different indicators. The how and why of endothermy evolved is really interesting and honestly something I would love to make a video about, but it is way too complicated for today. So let me know if that's something you would like to see in the future. All right, moving on to the next synapsid in our lineup, the one and only Catellorhynchus. Calling them tanks would be an understatement. They're estimated to have gotten to about 20 feet long, so about the size of a large Chevy Silverado. You might be thinking these reconstructions do not look correct. Their proportions can't possibly be right, especially looking at something like this lovely silhouette. Well, this is their skeleton. As you can see, their ribcage looks like it's part of a tunnel system. They were just built like that. Barrel-shaped bodies and small heads. That was their thing. And leaf-shaped teeth to chew on high-fiber plant material, which was then digested quite efficiently in the barrel. Just so you know, we have barely gotten started with synapsids, because during the Permian, a new group of them arose that would eventually give rise to the mammals, the Sauropsids. I know, sounds almost exactly like synapsids, but Sauropsids, a new group within synapsids. And now we are jumping into them, starting off with the top of the food chain. Let's play a little game. What do you get when you mix a pit bull and a snake and a saber-toothed cat? Get a thought in your head? You get this. A gorgonopsid, saber-toothed, predatory, Sauropsids. Yeah, we are not fucking around anymore. They're considered the dominant predators of the Permian. that we know of. It included species like the classic Gorgonops, Inostrancevia, Rubigia, and Soroctonus. Badass names if you ask me. Gorgonopsids were juiced the fuck up. They used their saber teeth to deliver slashing bites to their prey and intimidate their competitors. Damaged and healed skulls suggest that Gorgonopsids also bit each other's faces. They engaged in face biting with each other. Absolutely horrific. All right, for this next one, I want you to take a Gorgonopsid, picture in your head, and then run it through the wash. Now it's disfigured, grotesque. It probably looks something like Ankylosaurus, one of the largest Permian predators that we know of that could get to 20 feet long. They had massive heads with bone-crushing teeth and surprisingly heavy bones, which led scientists to believe they must have been scavengers, maybe ambush hunters on a good day. So heavy that some scientists entertained the idea that they might have been semi-aquatic. But a study done in 2021 changed everything. Using X-ray imaging to digitally reconstruct its skull, scientists discovered that the brain and balance organs of Ankylosaurus were specifically adapted for agile hunting. So, the thought of this rhino-sized beast capable of active hunting is absolutely heinous, if you ask me. And also, this is what Frenchies look like to me. No offense. They're cute, but they are absolutely built like this. I'm warning you. Keep breeding them, you're gonna have a teacup version of this. All right, this next one. If you're a fan of Pokemon, you're gonna love it. Bulbasaurus. Kind of named after Bulbasaur. Kind of. The scientists who named it in 2017 said it was technically named for their bulbous-shaped nasal boss. That kind of bony extra lump on their snout. Bulbous. So Bulbasaurus. But they also did admit that the name wasn't entirely coincidental. I don't know why they had to be so coy, but whatever. Bulbasaurus was like a turtle and a pig mixed together, but was of course not either of those things. They had a sharp beak to cut through plant material, and that's about it. Just cute as fuck. All right, the next one, I'm gonna have to start off by giving you some context before I show you any reconstructions. They've been a bit controversial in the paleo art community. It's called Aesteminosuchus. Aesteminosuchus. And as you can see, it has a pretty gnarly skull. Looks like a Halloween mask, to be honest. It's real ghoulish. They had multiple sets of horns projecting off of different parts of their skull, which earned them their name, the crowned crocodile. Not crocodiles though, obviously. This combined with the rest of their body made them about 10 feet long. Since they were discovered in 1960, paleo artists have tried to come up with ideas of what they would have looked like in life, with the ghoulish skull in mind. Let me show you some of my favorites. This is outrageous. Here's another one. And this one just looks like it's up to no good. There's this concept that's talked about a lot when it comes to reconstructing extinct animals, called shrink wrapping. You might have seen this go around Twitter a while ago, or wherever you peruse the internet. It's a good visual example of this. Essentially the idea that a lot more goes into the physical appearance of an animal than just their skeletal features. Soft tissues, which are only seen as impressions in some of the most well-preserved fossils in the world, which are obviously very rare. Here's an example of what reconstructing an elephant, zebra, and rhino would look like without taking soft tissues into account. Yeah, heinous. That's not to say that all reconstructions of anything ever are wrong, or don't take soft tissues into account. They've definitely gotten better with time. It's really just about keeping it in mind. Are Aesteminosuchus reconstructions the way they are because of shrink wrapping? Some of them for sure, but there are definitely some that seem more practical. Aesteminosuchus! That's enough of that one. So we've talked about some synapsids. We've talked about the members of a group that arose out of synapsids, the Therapsids. And there's one specific group of Therapsids that you should hold near and dear to your heart. The Cynodonts. Our great
One eternity later.
great grandpa, which means yes, we are also Cynodonts, and also technically Therapsids, and also technically Synapsids. We wear a lot of hats. Let me do a little quick visual. I still have the whiteboard. Hold on one second. This is like the crab video all over again. We've got the larger group, Synapsids. Inside of that, we've got Therapsids. Inside of that, we've got Cynodonts. Inside of that, we've got mammals. And inside of that, we have us. Necessary? Probably not. That wasn't necessary at all, but whatever. The Cynodonts were a step further in the long line of mammalian evolution, which of course they were unaware of at the time, but you know what the fuck I'm talking about. They had a set of more mammal-like characteristics that live on in us today, like differentiated teeth, incisors for cutting, canines for piercing, and cheek teeth for grinding. The word cynodont means dog teeth like a dog. They also had a more mammal-like brain case, the case that encompasses your brain, and my favorite, a secondary palate. There's a good chance you're eating while watching this video, and breathing at the same time. You can thank the Cynodonts for that. The development of the secondary palate allowed Cynodonts and their descendants to chew and breathe at the same time. Split it up. You know how much it sucks to eat when you have a stuffy nose because you can't breathe? Thank the Cynodonts, that's not your everyday reality. Apart from being groundbreaking, the Cynodonts were cute as fuck. They came in a variety of sizes, but were generally understood to have hair, and a lot of them were really small, which is just cute. Whether or not they had whiskers is kind of where things get fuzzy. There's some evidence that Cynodonts might have had them, but that's still up for debate. Whiskers today are found in marsupials, i.e. Australia, and placental mammals, which is everything that you think of as a mammal, the classic mammal. But whiskers are lacking in monotremes, which are egg-laying mammals, like the platypus and the echidna. Let me draw a little diagram. Okay, so mammals. Whoops. So marsupials and placental mammals are more closely related to each other than monotremes. Both of these two groups have whiskers. So it seems as though whiskers must have evolved within the common ancestor of marsupials and placental mammals. That common ancestor was alive in the late Jurassic period. But some papers have noted the presence of whisker pits in Permian age Cynodonts, arguing they did have whiskers. So what's the consensus? There's none for now. More research must be done. At this point, you're probably thinking that was a lot of synapsids, lots of diversity. But one thing that the Sauropsids had a leg up in was aquatic or semi-aquatic lifestyles. Some groups went back to the water. Well, joke's on you, I'm not even done with synapsids yet. And there are some that seem to have displayed semi-aquatic characteristics, possibly. Like Perplexosaurus, cute as fuck. Like Liliodorhynchus, closely related to Cotylodontus, which just makes sense. I wrote many pronunciations on the side of this script. And even one possible Cynodont, Crocinosuchus, maybe kind of like a fishing cat. And we're still not even done with the synapsids because I found a couple that kind of qualify as the strange specimens. So let's just keep the ball rolling. Allow me to introduce you to Eucambrosia mirabilis, just a fucking mouthful of a name, and potentially the oldest venomous vertebrate ever found. Telling you dude, synapsids were fucking on one during the Permian. I say potentially because the consensus has been reached on a shaky ground. So let me give you the whole rundown. Back in 1931, paleontologist Robert Broom describes Eucambrosia after discovering its remains in South Africa. He noticed a little depression, or fossa, behind each of its upper canine teeth. Robbie thought they possibly housed salivary glands. A year later, paleontologist
Franz Nopcha von Verschusilvás.
Let's call him Frank, because that name is wicked. Frank proposed that the fossa housed venom glands, i.e. spicy salivary glands. People loved this idea, understandably so. That is a badass hypothesis. So people kind of just went with it without looking into it very much. A few decades later, another scientist said Eucambrosia had deeply grooved teeth, deeply grooved canine teeth, which could have allowed it to deliver that venomous bite. But turned out that was wrong. He likely misinterpreted earlier drawings. But this misinformation was like the highway to hell for the scientific community. They were going for it, and they seemingly had evidence to do so. Fast forward to 2022. What do we have now? More developed technology. So what are we going to do with it? Micro CT scan some shit. Based on the scans, researchers determined that the fossae were either used for venom, which mixed with saliva and envenomated their prey as they bit, or the fossa were used for sensory organs. The venom hypothesis seems more likely, and somehow, after all the back and forth and the misinterpretation, seems the most likely reason to this day. Would I call it a consensus? Probably not. But if true, Eucambrosia would represent the oldest venomous vertebrate ever found, which is pretty sick. I know you're probably getting tired of synapsids at this point, and honestly so am I. I just have one more to introduce you to before we get to the next group of strange specimens on this lineup. Siminia, also known as the Permian primate, because they seem to have lived their life in the trees. Their bodies were about 20 inches long. They had a long, slender tail that was about 120% of their body length. They also had very large fingers and huge hands compared to their arms, with claw-like bones at the end of each finger. They even had their first digit set off at an angle, so kind of like an opposable thumb. Pretty cool. All right. That's it with the synapsids. I know that was a lot. I'm gonna be honest, I wasn't expecting it to go on for that long, but I kept running into species that I felt like I just had to include. And then there were a couple times that I thought I found another sauropsid, but it turned out to be a synapsid, like Bulbasaurus. But what are you gonna do?
You have no power here.
So, who was ahead in this tug of war during this period? I think it's safe to say that what I presented suggests that synapsids ran shit during this time. They were the dominant group. Did I maybe favor synapsids too much and not make it an even fight by human error? Probably. I like synapsids more. I'm not afraid to say it. I like our lineage more. And there's definitely something to be said about the fragile nature of the fossil record. It favors big, thick-boned animals, not tiny lizard-like creatures. One paper published a few years ago started to address this. The Permian has always been considered the age of the synapsids, but was that really the case? There are plenty of smaller synapsids that have been historically overlooked, and as more and more are discovered, they might end up taking over in terms of overall diversity. It was just a lot of lizard-looking things. They were still very lizard-like in shape. So me personally, I'm cool with it being the age of the synapsids, because they were weird as fuck and also cool. But let me know where you stand. And let's move on to a different different group. The next strange specimen is another one of the most well-known animals from the Permian. We've actually talked about them before on this channel. So I wanted to bring on my good friend Christian, also known as Shark Bytes, to give his own twist on this introduction. He's a marine biologist and shark scientist, and is the guy to turn to for everything sharks and shark relatives. If you've never seen his content, you're gonna love him. So I'm gonna turn it over to him now to introduce you to the last two strange specimens on this lineup.
Hi Lindsay, thanks for having me on the channel, and thanks for giving me the task of talking to you guys through some messed up Permian sharks. I'll admit my speciality revolves around living sharks, but you gotta love the extinct ones because they are downright odd. First then, I'm going to introduce you to this slippery eel-looking shark, Orthacanthus. Orthacanthus was a 3-meter long extinct shark-like xenocanthid that likely lived in freshwater swamp habitats throughout the Carboniferous and into the Permian period, which was somewhere around 250 to 300 million years ago. Its name literally translates to straight spine, pretty aptly named for that fat-off spine on its head. Based on where paleontologists were finding fossils of this guy, i.e. North America and Europe, we know that it was probably an apex predator in the oily, swampy habitats of the northern hemisphere. Just looking at it, it's like a combination of frilled sharks, spiny dogfish, and bull sharks from today's oceans, which is a lethal combo. There has been some debate as to whether it was an obligate freshwater species, meaning it could only live in freshwater, or whether it was a euryhaline species, which means it could tolerate a wide range of salinities, kind of like modern-day bull sharks. But we do know for sure it spent at least some, if not all of its time in freshwater. From fossilized stomach contents, we can see that Orthacanthus likely preyed on amphibians and other fish species, including this little guy, Triadus. Triadus, which was another xenocanth shark, looked pretty similar to Orthacanthus, especially with that dorsal spine. And it turns out that Triadus and Orthacanthus likely had a predator-prey dynamic with each other, with Orthacanthus almost undoubtedly feeding on Triadus. We know this because Orthacanthus fossils have been found with the dorsal spines of Triadus lodged in their faces. Ouch. This is very similar to the modern day sharks that have predator-prey relationships with stingrays, like hammerhead sharks who just messed with the wrong stingray and got a barb to the face for their troubles. But that's not all Orthacanthus fed on. Oh no. In tough times, this prehistoric sicko likely fed on its own offspring. Yep, that's right, every now and again, Orthacanthus ate its own babies. Professor Mike Benton, along with his co-authors in 2016, analysed the contents of Orthacanthus coprolites, aka fossil poo. They knew that it was the poo of Orthacanthus because they had a funky-shaped corkscrew rectum, which meant their poo came out spiral-shaped, so it's relatively easily identifiable. And within those coprolites, they found a shitload of juvenile Orthacanthus teeth, confirming that they probably ate their own offspring. That's known as filial cannibalism, by the way, for those of you out there that for some reason were wondering what the definition was. The scientists aren't 100% certain on why they did it, but because freshwater swamps were being colonized by loads of freshwater fish, at points in time resources in those areas might have become scarce, and Orthacanthus just adopted a mama gotta eat strategy. Grim. Now, I just mentioned to you guys about Orthacanthus poo being spiral shaped, and that kind of nicely brings us on to this weird looking dude, Helicoprion, the buzzsaw shark. You know it, you love it, it's got to be probably one of the goofiest looking prehistoric shark species there was. On the technicality, we can't really refer to this guy as a shark because it was a member of the holocephalans. These are your ratfish. No, not like that, more like this. So Helicoprion was a distant relative of these cute little guys who hang out in the deep sea today. As we've heard in one of Lindsay's previous videos, Karpinski, known for his paleontology skills and strong goatee game, was the guy who discovered the first Helicoprion fossil. But because all sharks and their relatives, including the holocephalans, have cartilaginous skeletons, the only bit that was fossilized was these spiral teeth, and scientists at the time really had no idea where it was supposed to be on Helicoprion's body. So in true early 20th century fashion, we got some great scientific speculation. Take a look at this handy gallery of Helicoprion drawings and where they thought that spiral might be on the body. So we've got it on the back and on the dorsal fin. We've got it coiling up and out of the snout like some kind of lethal spiky fruit roll up. It coils up and it coils down. This one here looks like he's about to celebrate New Year's Eve with a party blowout. We've got another one that looks suspiciously like a basking shark. This guy over here who's just pure hating his life. And then this one where they've just plonked the vortex of doom on the underside of a stingray. Were they high? You can see though the majority of them thought it was somewhere near the mouth. kind of. But in 2013, some pretty clever scientists decided to CT scan the near perfect fossil from Idaho and definitively proved that the saw was in the mouth, and specifically, it was in the lower jaw. And it was this discovery that really helped them figure out how Helicoprion used that impressive tooth spiral. If you were reading the scientific literature about Helicoprion, you'd be met with paragraphs of death like this one, which uses words like palatine ramus and ethmoid process. Instead, you guys are going to get the sharp bites explanation. Contrary to their buzzsaw namesake, Helicoprion's tooth spiral didn't spin around in their mouths, chopping up everything in its path like a bad accident in a workshop. It was actually fixed in place apart from when it was growing. J.B. Ramsey in 2015 suggested that because the spiral was shaped how it was, it couldn't feed on hard prey because hard prey would just slip out of the jaws. Try and cut a walnut with a pair of scissors and you'll get what I mean. So because of this, they'd feed on soft prey items like squid because they'd easily be captured and trapped by the tooth spiral. But it was also suggested that they fed on ammonites. Ammonites had hard shells though, so how did they eat them? Well, the Helicoprion would approach its ammonite prey with its mouth open wide. The soft body of the ammonite would be impaled on the tooth spiral, and as the jaw closed, those teeth would pull the soft body into the mouth and down the oral cavity, while the upper jaw would simultaneously close and push away the hard shell. Helicoprion would literally teeth slurp those ammonites out of their shells. That is grim. To help me demonstrate this motion, I've got a handy cutout of a Helicoprion head and jaw. And if you're asking whether I spent an hour making this on a Monday afternoon, you are absolutely correct. So you can see as the Helicoprion clamped down on its prey species, i.e. ammonites, which let's say are my head, how the teeth on the lower jaw could grasp the soft part of that prey species, pulling it further into the mouth, where the upper jaw and the head would push away any hard shells. Right, okay, that's enough demonstrating with that thing. I think I just wanted an arts and craft afternoon, really. So ammonites and Helicoprion were likely locked in this teeth-slurping predator-prey dynamic for a long, long time, as both of them somehow managed to survive the Permian mass extinction event, which wiped out the best part of 90% of all marine animals. But I'll leave that to the pro. Back to you, Lindsay.
So we've talked about many Permian creatures of different sizes, different lifestyles, some of the lesser known, and some of the icons. I haven't told you yet about the most iconic aspect of the Permian, the way it ended. Despite being the second most well-known mass extinction, obviously after the dinosaurs, the End-Permian extinction event is known as the #1 most devastating of the Big Five mass extinctions. So much so, it has earned the nickname the Great Dying. It wiped out the vast majority of life on Earth, with the extinction of something around 90% of all species and up to 96% of life in the oceans. 96%, dude. This is seen in the fossil record as a drastic loss in representative species from the boundary of the Permian to the Triassic. Sea scorpions, completely wiped out. The spiny sharks, the acanthodians, wiped out. The trilobites, completely wiped out. We're done with them. The Great Dying was not fucking around. With a catastrophe of these proportions, as you would probably guess, there are plenty of hypotheses as to why this happened. What could have caused something like this? I'll break down a few of them that have evidence. The first, an asteroid impact. Of course, the idea of an asteroid has to be thrown into the mix. Geologist Gregory Redelec found quartz crystals with microscopic fractures in rocks from Australia and Antarctica that line up perfectly with the Permian-Triassic boundary. He said that pressure greater than a nuclear bomb would have been needed to create that type of quartz, and that could have only been from an asteroid. If true, the asteroid would have released massive amounts of toxic gases, blocking out the sun and causing temperature drops, acid rain, and darkness, and life doesn't like any of those things. Another theory points to a lack of oxygen in the deep ocean. English geologists Paul Wignall and Richard Twitchett found evidence of ocean anoxia in rocks that formed in shallow waters during this time. They suggested that a lack of ocean currents, possibly due to an absence of ice caps, could have allowed anoxic water to build up, spread, killing off marine life. So, maybe a component. But the most widely accepted theory is volcanoes, and there is plenty of evidence for this in Siberia. The Siberian Traps are a massive area of lava flows that cover like 1 million square miles and date to the end of the Permian. Apparently, the amount of lava produced would have been enough to cover the entire planet in 20 feet of it. That's a lot of lava if you ask me. But it wasn't just the lava that caused problems, it was the volcanic gases that were released at the same time. These gases would have led to the acid rain, the blocking out the sun, with sulfate molecules, which would in turn cool the earth. I know it probably seems like lava would make shit hotter overall, but no sun equals cold, and sun beats lava. This would have led to glaciers at the poles, which would have obviously sucked up ocean water, leading to lower sea levels, leading to the destruction of shallow water ecosystems. Pair that with the carbon dioxide from the volcanoes and organic matter being broken down, and boom, you've got a greenhouse effect. and a nasty one at that. Of course, it was probably a few of these scenarios that got served as a combo that led to the mass extinction. The perfect storm to cause the biggest catastrophe the world has ever seen, that we know of. But life still managed to find a way out of it. Obviously, we're here talking about it, and we're not even halfway through the series. This was probably the closest to the end of the world animals ever saw, but it was still not the end of the world. Every species alive today can be traced to an ancestor that made it out of the Great Dying, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. The world is unbelievably diverse, millions and millions of species, and that's all because of the few that survived. And that brings me to the last species on our lineup that I want to introduce you to. I know, this late in the video is a bit jarring, a bit unsettling, but class is not over yet, so sit down. There's one animal in particular that's often talked about in the context of this extinction, and the fact that it made it out. Lystrosaurus. You guessed it, another synapsid. Closely related to Bulbasaurus, as you would probably guess from the beak, and also very cute. Like doomsday preppers today, they liked burrowing in the ground. Their mix of traits suggests they were built for arid environments, and the presence of closely spaced growth rings in the tusks of South African and Antarctic species suggests they might have been some of the earliest animals to hibernate that we know of. This combination of behaviors and traits ended up being very useful during the mass extinction. They were all over the place, and based on the fossil record in the early Triassic, they were the single most common vertebrate on land. But they were a dead end, as far as we know, because the process of recovery on Earth was not an easy one. It would result in a new wave of nature's trial run that included some of the most bizarre vertebrates the world has ever seen, that I'll be introducing you to in the next episode, the Triassic, so stay tuned for that. The Paleozoic era is over, and I have a little surprise for you next week. I've been working with a team to add some cool components to my videos, and we're going to be doing a little test round of it. Gian and I are putting together a compilation of all the videos so far to be like a Paleozoic era compilation, and the team I've been working with is going to mess around with some of those cool components that I'm talking about. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be a long-ass compilation with new stuff to find. So I hope you're excited. So be sure to subscribe so you watch the history of life on Earth unfold. Check out my Patreon for behind-the-scenes updates and our Discord server. Remove your personal information from the web at joindeleteme.com/Lindsay and use code Lindsay for 20% off Delete Me International plans. And for now, stay curious. The world has a lot for us to learn. See ya!